Fraser, big budget day yesterday. What are your thoughts on the budget?
I knew that you'd. Well, I thought you'd ask me that. I didn't listen to the whole thing, but I did listen to part of it, and I was really quite surprised by the number of times that he referred to sort of stimulating a green economy. There was lots of stuff in there, wasn't there, about the infrastructure bank, which is kind of the green investment bank remade. I don't know how different it will be, but they're talking about £12 billion that will sort of leverage up to about £40 billion eventually of infrastructure spending. They were talking about really trying to fire up the different regions with investment, focusing on the wind turbine industry and sort of Humside and Teesside and things like that. There was certainly a lot of talk or commentary that related to green, which I found quite positive. I mean, it's interesting. I've been thinking about what are we going to talk about on this podcast this month, and the thing that really came to the fore was carbon pricing. There's been some quite good articles out there, people talking about carbon pricing, and if we're really going to initiate this transformation, what's the price signal? Because that's how our economies work. We really respond to price. So what's the price signal that's going to sort of drive things? And so from a budgetary perspective, there was a lot of kind of let's spend lots of money supporting green, digital or investment. And it's fine to sort of have X number of billions of pounds spent on this or that or whatever. But in reality, that's a kind of temporary spend that doesn't create necessarily a structural change.
Right.
And I think for me, what I'd rather the Chancellor had said is actually create a long-term driver for making decisions, that enables you to sort of say, well, actually, carbon is valued at this price, and therefore I need to make this investment. It's not based on a grant or on some kind of innovation scheme or whatever it might be. It's based on a number that is sort of quite objective in terms of making the switch.
For the layman, how is carbon priced now? And what would you do to tweak that in order to get it to where you'd like to see it?
Just going backwards, we've had some very, very successful schemes in the past that have used the pricing of emissions to solve, potentially global issues. So the hole in the ozone layer that was sort of expanding, and they realized it was due to CFCs. Sure. They created a protocol to effectively price CFCs, and they issued, permits or licenses and a certain amount of supply of those to produce CFCs, and then effectively decrease the supply, increase the price, and we've actually really solved that very big problem of the ozone layer. So they tried to obviously create the same kind of structure for carbon dioxide emissions, but carbon dioxide emissions were on a much grander scale. Almost everybody emits carbon dioxide in some way, shape or form. And so we had the Kyoto Protocol originally, and then that sort of moved into Europe created the emissions trading scheme, the ETS. And that was initially sort of hailed as a bit of a success, and then it became an abject failure because the price of carbon, went down to almost zero.
Right.
Because of the structure of that market. It just wasn't sort of set up necessarily to create success. It was set up to create political success, let's say,
right. Okay.
Rather than actual success. So we now have a re-emergence, I think. So Europe's ETS, carbon at the moment is trading at around €40 a tonne.
Okay.
And so that's, significantly up from where it was. And I think it's increased to about 60% that price since November last year. So, there's this kind of view that if Biden's sort of got this $1.9 trillion package through, through the House of Representatives, it's now got to go through the Senate, where I think the Democrats have a slight majority, and then you've got a significant push from the US, let's say, towards climate-friendly initiatives. And anything that starts to push for is going to sort of help that price of carbon move in the right direction, which is to go north, to go higher. So I think there's a general consensus now that, if you look at the major economies, there is a commitment politically to climate mitigation or carbon mitigation and sort of climate friendly policies. And we saw it yesterday in the budget, just like we were saying with Rishi Sunak talking about that, not on such a grand scale as the US, but there's certainly the momentum there, and Europe's talking about it. So the question is, what is the price of carbon dioxide that actually will create real investment decisions, to flip from diesel or petrol to electric, or to flip from fossil fuel-based energy to renewable energy, et cetera, et cetera. So at the moment, as I said, the price of carbon dioxide in the market is about 40 euros a tonne. Now, in the UK, we have a carbon intensity of about 0.22 kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour of energy that you consume from the national grid. Okay, so when you plug in your kettle, you will be using 0.22 kilograms of carbon dioxide. You'll be effectively emitting that for every kilowatt hour that you use. Now, if you translate that into the 40 euros per tonne, you get to about 0.8 of a pence per kilowatt hour related to carbon. Now, if you remember in our last podcast, we were sort of saying that the economics of, let's say, transitioning to storage or making storage work at the moment, they were kind of off by about 5 pence. So what that means is that effectively, let's just take that as let's say instead of 0.8, let's just make it 1 pence to make the maths easier. So what that's sort of saying is that, if you had a price of carbon that was 5 times that 40 euros, then essentially you would have something that would then translate into a value that would help you sort of facilitate maybe that kind of sort of renewables with storage, possibly. So at the moment we've got a price at, let's say, 40. There's one example where maybe 200 euros a tonne would sort of start to make sense in terms of the price of electricity from the grid. So just going back to, say, The Economist, which I was looking at the latest week, Economist, I was looking at the science and technology section, which I always find really, really interesting. Yeah. And 4 out of the 5 articles in the science and technology were all about the climate, the environment, ecology.
Right. Yeah.
Which I just find fascinating, because I haven't seen that before in that particular magazine for a while. And again, it sort of correlates with all of the stuff that's going on out there that we're listening and hearing and sort of seeing. And so one of those articles was looking at the kind of range of carbon pricing to enable certain technologies to make economic sense. And this is sort of based on a kind of meta study across numerous different studies of different carbon pricing sort of abatement policies. And so if you took electric vehicles, it was sort of saying actually you need a range for electric vehicles of anything between, say, 300 to 600 euros a tonne to kind of make electric vehicles a valid investment switch from fossil fuels.
But it's currently 40.
It's 40 in the market. It's 40.
Okay.
Currently at 40. So
that's a big difference, though, isn't it?
It's a big difference, and I think this is the key thing, that at the moment the way that the carbon is priced and structured through political quote unquote interference, because they just don't want to do something that is politically negative or difficult to make. I mean, look at what happened in France when they just tried to they tried to increase the tax, which you could say was a climate tax, on petrol. There were riots. There was like the Gilets Jaunes were out, and it was sort of revolution on the streets. And it's kind of like, how do you get carbon to a price that actually really makes sense? And it is going to take a politician with a spine to sort of stand up, or a political party, or a group of a political region or groups of countries, whatever, it won't be one person, to stand up and say, this is what we really need to do. And sorry, I'm a bit of a diatribe, but if you go back to 2006, which was when I sort of first came into the climate an energy area,
Yeah.
I was sort of new to this, and there was Nicholas Stern who sort of released, and I sort of probably should go back and reread it. But it was the economics of climate change. It was
Right.
basically a very, very big investigation, economic investigation at a very high level, very well respected group of people looking at that, into if you act at a certain point, what is the impact on GDP, and how does the impact on GDP change the longer you leave it, and what's the impact of different prices of carbon dioxide. And even then, back in 2006, I think he was sort of saying that, the price of carbon dioxide needs to be, north of 100,
Right.
£100 per ton, and that really you're only going to get proper action, in the hundreds. And so I've just been, I'm not saying I have the answer, but I just think it's really, if you look at the way policies are being put together, it's all about throwing money at problems, which is fine in the short term, but we're not throwing signals at the problem.
Right.
I.e., we're not creating, a signal that really drives change across the board. And that's, and this is where, I think the US or Biden is sort of really thinking about carbon pricing. I know a lot of people have been pushing for it, but the more I look at, the policies that get brought forward, they're all short-term policies, and they're not really signals for sort of driving significant change. On that point, though, solar and wind at the moment on their own don't actually need a carbon price to make them viable. I think we were saying this in the last podcast. Large-scale solar, large-scale wind in the right places do not require carbon to be priced at anything at the moment for them to be viable.
Right.
It's the other things that are actually much harder to do, like how do we transition to hydrogen or electric, or what do we do about steel and dependence on coal, and et cetera, et cetera.
So just just going back to that question you were talking about the market. It just strikes me it's not a free market then, is it? The sort of price that carbon trades at needs to be sort of artificially fixed.
Interestingly, the carbon market, you can trade that as an investor.
Yeah.
And I find that really bizarre. Okay, so my background is in finance. I spent 10 years in finance, and I sort of, I've been exposed to that world. My view is that the carbon market should not be tradable by any people other than those who are mitigating carbon, i.e. it should be a fully regulated market, because otherwise you get people gambling that market.
Yep.
And actually what climate is not something to be gambled.
No.
It's something which is very serious, and we need to have serious prices. Now the investors will say, but we're getting the price to the right level. Well, yeah, the right level in terms of sort of supply and demand, which is fine. But actually, what we really need is to just get the right price to drive the action. And I just don't think that investors should be involved in that market.
So it's not like any other kind of commodity then, because the climate is too important to gamble. So therefore, it's a market where there are parameters set by, let's say, government, as opposed to a free market where the value of that can rise and fall depending on the value of that commodity.
Yeah, well, actually, or on the perceived value of that commodity by the players in that market.
Okay.
And I think with carbon dioxide, the price in reality should be set at a regulatory level. It should be allowed to rise or fall based on how well we are doing as whatever region that price covers. And when we've achieved our targets, then that price can come back down. It's almost like a tax,
Right.
on a tax on emissions fixed by government that is not there for manipulation by the investment community for profit. So at the moment, if we, going back to the €40 example in the UK, only 0.8 pence per kilowatt hour of our electricity price is effectively, on that price, is effectively related to carbon dioxide. Now, is that going to force me, when I'm paying 18 pence a kilowatt hour, to sort of think about what I'm doing, that 0.8 pence? No. But if that suddenly becomes 5 pence or something significant, then it will engender change in the way that I sort of view to kind of reduce those costs. And that's me, with a fairly small electrical spend. You start to move to organizations with large, not just electrical spend, but sort of energy spend, in whatever format that comes in. And then you're talking about millions of pounds that then hits the bottom line and actually does, force them to make change. The problem is at the moment, we've got, going back to our original point of the budget, is that we're taking a stance where we just spend money to support industries, and that doesn't get anybody to really make change.
Okay.
Right? It just gets us to be innovative in certain industries, but it doesn't actually force us to really invest in what we need to do when we're in dirty, polluting industries, or even dirty, polluting cars. It's not about industries. It's all of us involved in this with the things that we drive and where we fly and how we do things.
Fraser, do you feel like you're a bit of a lone voice in all of this? It seems that it's well thought through, it makes sense. So, are other people saying the same thing? And if so, why are we not reading articles in The Economist that have that kind of angle to them?
Well, the Economist, actually, interestingly, has been talking about a market price for a long time. I suppose that particular paper is driven by market forces and thinks that things can be solved through price, and that's where the carbon price sort of comes in. And there's been a huge amount of work. I'm not a lone voice, absolutely not. This is something that people have been going on about for quite a long time now. Okay. The problem is, politically, it's really difficult to instigate, and I think that's the challenge. So if you go back to the EU, right? This is an interesting sort of factoid. So myself and a sort of a colleague called Tom Rivett-Carnac, who now works for Global Optimism, we worked on a project back in the early in a sort of the sort of climate career, and it was for a wind turbine manufacturer, and a business, and we looked at the cost of carbon embedded in different technologies. And what was interesting was that the EU back in the 90s did a massive study, the social cost of carbon to society of different generation types. So I'll give you an example. If you look at a coal-fired power station, we can look at, carbon dioxide, it's X number of kilograms of carbon dioxide. We can price that. But what's the real social cost of that coal-fired power station? Well, the social cost is not just the climate cost, but it's particulate matter that causes lung and various other sort of medical issues, that then has costs for society in terms of early death rates or insurance costs and various other things. It has costs in terms of those particulates laying down on agricultural land of that plant, which then causes costs for society in terms of food production and health and various other things. And so actually, when you look at different types of things that we do at the moment, you need to look at them as the wider social cost. And climate is one part of that, but there is a wider social cost. And so when Europe looked at this in the 90s, massive costs to society for every kilowatt hour produced from coal, also from oil, actually also from wood, because wood is pure carbon, and it gives particulate matter. And so actually they looked at the social cost of carbon, and what their big thing back in the 90s was how do we price this? And politically, it was like, do we put this social cost onto every kilowatt hour of energy generation from a particular source, or do we incentivize cleaner generation? Okay. And they went down the incentivization. So what you saw in the late 90s and early 2000s was the sort of the takeoff of the feed-in tariffs and various other things like this.
Yeah.
and they took the politically easier route. Now, imagine what the world would be like now if, 20 years ago, Europe had actually said, right, you know what, guys, we're going to take the harder route. It's harder, but we're
Yeah.
going to do it, which is we're going to price in the social cost of capital. You're then talking about, the kind of numbers we're talking about in terms of multiple cents per kilowatt hour. So, I think they were talking about the social cost of capital for coal, and don't quote me on this, but let's say 2.5 euro cents per kilowatt hour. But on a cost of production of, let's say, 3 or 4. So it was adding 50% to the cost of the
Right.
production of that, of energy from coal, for instance. That kind of multitude, and that was what they found too hard. So, but it's these kind of political decisions, and that research is all still there. And in fact, it wasn't just Europe. America did exactly the same thing. They looked at this. You can find it online. Social cost of carbon, in the US, and you'll find it for Europe. In some ways, we need to go back to that kind of work that was done, and reassess that in the context of what we need to do now.
When you say, I mean, I understand what you mean when you say, it's politically hard. It's only hard because people and businesses don't want to hear it.
Well, yeah, it's how it's communicated down to our daily lives, I suppose. So, if somebody says, so going back to the budget again, yesterday he said, right, the tax on petrol and diesel will remain where it was last year. So we're not increasing that. So
Yeah.
on one hand, he's talking about massive green investment.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, he's saying, well, we're not going to tax, dirty fuels and emissions and things like this. And for, remember this, the other thing that's really critical at the moment, it's not just climate about these things, but it's also about air quality. And
Sure.
the air quality in a lot of these places with all the homes that are being built, and we're getting places now that are way above where the regulatory maximum should be. So
Yeah.
I was, that it's those kind of things that show the kind of cognitive dissonance in our government, but also in others, when we sort of spout about green recovery, green investment, but at the same
Yeah.
time, we're not willing to try and face
Do it.
up and tax.
Well, isn't that a cognitive dissonance in terms of the market? It's only politically difficult because the people who buy petrol and drive cars don't want to hear it. So they're the ones that say we need to be concerned about climate change. We need to do all we can. But the fact is, they will squeal when petrol prices go up because of tax. Because I think it's easy to point finger at government, but actually the finger needs to be pointed at us as consumers, because we're the ones that demand constantly lower prices for our energy, for our fuel. So we worry about particulates, we worry about the effect on agriculture, we worry about air quality, etc. But actually too many of us don't worry about it enough, because when it comes to the crunch, we're the ones that squeal, which then makes the politicians wary.
Yeah, I mean, we've become drunk on low prices, haven't we? I mean,
Yeah.
I did a podcast a while ago called Zen and the Art of Solar PV Maintenance, and that was all about quality. And it's
Yeah.
almost like quality has disappeared from our lexicon.
Yeah.
So whether that's quality of life, quality of air, quality of, whatever it might be, and it's all about price. Price is king. Now,
Yeah.
don't get me wrong. I drive a diesel, and I'd love to be able to drive an electric, but I just can't afford it.
Yeah.
So there is a price point at which I need to be able to transfer to that. But you can either wait for the prices to come down, or you can drive that through carbon pricing. But you're absolutely right. This is really, really difficult. And so the other thing is, do you then extract this decision away from politics?
Okay.
So, is there a way that you can extract this and it becomes an independent body that regulates, just like we regulate the price of water and the price of electricity, and we regulate the price of carbon dioxide, and it's sort of set by an independent body that just, and that feeds through to everything that we do. And it's not, at the whim of whichever prime minister or chancellor comes in. And I don't know whether that's possible or not, but these are the kind of big questions. I think what's really interesting, actually, you talked about people standing up. I think our generation may not be the ones that do it. It may be the younger generation. I don't know whether you saw these kids in Australia that have now initiated a class action lawsuit.
Oh yes, yes, yes.
Against I think it's a coal mine,
Right. Yes,
and
that's right. Yeah.
so the coal mines had to stop whilst this
Right.
is going on. And
Yeah.
so what's happening is maybe sort of the younger generation are now starting to feel really empowered
Yeah.
to sort of and educated in how to actually create change through maybe these other, rather than berating politicians or whatever, actually taking action in a way that kind of tries to stop some of these
Yes.
sort of detrimental ways of living. It's one example, and we've got this Cumbria, the coal mine in Cumbria. For us to approve a coal mine,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
in the COP26 year, when
Yes.
we are just getting all the information about climate, just insane. I mean, who can make,
Yeah.
and whether that's 500 jobs or 5,000 jobs, what is the,
Yeah.
we've got to sort of try and repurpose everything towards this goal. So there are other ways of making this happen other than waiting for politicians, and I think maybe that's what we're sort of starting to wake up to.
This is a How production. Please follow this podcast and share.